The perceived value of intellectual property. Greetings, and hello and welcome back to Invent Anything. And today we're exploring how intellectual property evolves from a legal right into one of the most powerful business assets for creating value, protecting innovations, financing growth, and building competitive advantage. I'm John Cronin, and welcome back. In this episode, we'll cover 6 topics. The first topic is the history of the value of IP versus the perceived value of IP. In the second topic, we'll talk about litigation as one of those areas. In topic number 3, we'll talk about IP monetization, like licensing and selling IP. Then we'll go to topic number 4, talking about doing deals, and move on to topic number 5, where intellectual property helps with financings like M&As and raising money and asset-based loans. And finally, we'll talk about what affects the perceived value of IP. I chose these 6 topics to try to sort of think about the different ways it impacts strategy and how companies can use IP strategy to enhance themselves. And so basically, when I think about doing podcasts, I think about the audiences. And one audience I know is for those who know patents but don't understand how intellectual property creates business value. This is definitely for you. This concept of perceived value of intellectual property is something that I've been using in my practice at ipCapital with our thousands of clients over 30 years. I've come to really understand the very difference of thinking of, say, patent counsel and inventors and business people. And I've been talking about the perceived value of intellectual property for almost 2 decades. And I decided to do this podcast. I know you will enjoy it because it sheds new light on, for you maybe, to broaden the view of intellectual property to get a higher value for it. Also, some of the audiences I think are definitely for entrepreneurs, which is a big part of my practice. I work with a lot of small companies, and here we're really trying to impact a lot of those value points I just mentioned. For leaders of large companies, you'll see how litigation, monetization, and things like financing fit together so that they enhance the overall perceived value. I think that, one person in a large company, an executive might think it's for one thing like litigation, and another person might think it's for another thing, which is for licensing, and another person might think, from the brand perspective. But I want to cover it all. Also, for executives, boards, investors, and business managers, this is definitely for you to understand how IP has now become this strategic asset to raise value. For anyone trying to connect patents to licensing and M&A and financing, this is definitely for you. We'll talk a lot about, the things that need to be valuable in those areas of business. And then for anyone in the journey of IP strategy that wants to commercialize, this is a great roadmap. And I'll bet you could use this metaphor of the perceived value of IP and really just change the way you think about IP. This is John Cronin, Invent Anything, and in this episode we'll explore how intellectual property creates business value from its historical evolution and strategic use in litigation and monetization and deal making and financing, showing that IP has become the most powerful competitive asset in modern economy. So stay tuned.
Inventions keep the world spinning. From fire and the wheel to today's high tech, inventions power change. Turn your inventions into reality. Learn how to get your ideas to market. This is Invent Anything with John Cronin.
So let's get into it. Topic number 1, the history of value versus perceived value. So this notion of perceived value came to me a number of years ago because I'm constantly talking to new clients about, patents. And they constantly bring up, that they don't want to sue anybody, or, that they don't want to be in a position that they have to use patents to sue people. And it turns out that sort of 90% of people think that that's the reason for patents, is to sue people. I think in 30 years, I've maybe recommended a strategy for suing somebody else based on patents maybe twice in the thousands of clients I have. So it may be kind of strange to think about that even though patents are by definition a vehicle to stop somebody else from using or selling, that using it for litigation is the last resort. So we'll talk about that. The U.S. Constitution historically shows that patents in Article 1, Section 8 calls the patent of the patent and copyright law shows that Congress should give the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing a limited time to authors and inventors exclusive rights for their respective writings and discoveries. I mean, that's what Congress had to say back in the 1700s. So the very nature of the history of intellectual property was to progress science. Litigation is not the thing that's going to progress science directly. So basically, you start off with that first gear, right? That it's a valuable thing. It was designed to, promote the progress of science. History shows us over time, and I've studied the history of patents, that it started off more as an honor. Early inventors, when they got a patent, was like a badge of honor. As a matter of fact, the first patent was in by a Vermonter, where I live, on potash, which is soap. Uh, Patents became something that were very respected in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It would be like if you had a patent that people respected that. There's this great story about Carnegie, who traveled across the entire country in a train to see Bessemer, who was running Bessemer Steel, to ask for the rights to license the Bessemer patents. That's very different than the world we live in today, that it was respected. Patents as a business threat is another thing. Farnsworth versus RCA shows us this. Farnsworth, a young kid who drew the first television concept when he was 16 years old, later on filed a patent and started to create more patents and develop the television. We had RCA, who had radios, and they became very, very worried that Farnsworth was going to take over their business. So RCA did all sorts of things to try to threaten the foundation of Farnsworth's business, and eventually they won. So now what happens is you kind of move from respect like Bessemer to things like, business threats by using IP to surround or to stop or even litigate. In 1985, when I was at IBM, there was this sort of thinking about patents as the DRAM, the DRAMs, the dynamic RAMs, became sort of the crude oil of 1985, that it became a very tradable commodity, and the number of patents soared. And so we kind of looked at patents protecting huge innovations. Here, we were protecting them, say, against Japan, who was copying and selling them back to the US. We created even new laws to stop inbound copycats. Then there was a dot-com where everybody was getting patents. And of course, when the companies blew up, the investors had basically patents left. And so they started using patents to sue people to try to recoup their money. And then what happens is that patents become something that kind of is looked at investor returns. That somehow you can help the investor returns if you have a good portfolio. And of course, there were non-practicing entities and trolls. These are companies that didn't have products but had patents and sued everybody. So the name of patents got to be bad. And then Obama and the American Invent Act basically came out from the White House and said the patents were hurting innovation. And now we have, the problem for a long time that patents don't seem to be very valuable. But now all of a sudden, with one of my friends, John Squires, who's the new commissioner of the Patent Office, basically through the changes there, they've made patents stronger again by not allowing a lot of the inter partes reviews. So look at all that change. And this is just the very clip notes of it. From a historical case, it kind of is, and some of the people who talk a lot about this is there's a pendulum that swings back and forth. Every 10 or 15 years, patents are worth less, patents are worth more. Right now, patents are worth more. So for those listening, that's the good news. If we also think about the history, patents, if you take a look at them, they're precursors to market growth. Since you're patenting things and it costs a lot of money, you start investing in those things that you're going to build later on. And so if you take a look at the trend charts on different sectors, they can literally tell you where the markets are growing. So historically, patents have that kind of value. You can use it to kind of gauge markets. Historically, also, what happened is that patents kind of had a new chess piece on its board with open source. So now what happens is you're writing open source code and you want to not have patents. You want to keep things open source. So it became sort of an anti-value that patents were like stopping the progress of commerce through open source. But that kind of leveled off, and things that are open source is fine, but there's still protection. But in this time frame of the NPEs, the dot-coms, and open source, up came all sorts of interesting business models, IP asset buyers like Intellectual Ventures or RPX or Red Hat. I've lived through that, worked with these companies, and saw the drastic kind of whipping back and forth about the value of IP. Also, historically, I witnessed personally a change when I was at IBM as an inventor, and then later on became their top inventor. After about 4 or 5 years, I ended up recognizing that there was a shift in the thinking of patents. There was a stockholders meeting, and a very small stockholder got up, an elderly lady, and kind of shouted at the CEO that says, why is IBM dropped to number 9 in patents, and the stock's going down. So because of that, IBM took some action and decided through a number of things to improve the number of patents they got. And I got to create and run the IBM Patent Factory. And we went from 1,000 to 3,500 patents, but also, with the sister group, we did monetization. We went from 20 million to 2 billion a year after about 4 or 5 years. So I actually saw at IBM the value of IP change, and we started using it heavily in marketing, and we got to number 1 in patents. And I think we were there for about 25, 30 years. So this whole patent factory was a kind of a new approach, although it kind of rewrites the approach that Sarnoff took at RCA, trying to put patents on steroids. There's another thing about the value of patents, and it's different in different countries. So in the US, it's a very strong asset. Say in China, the patent office only started there in 1985 anyway. So the assets in China, there's not a lot of companies that sue companies in China. I mean, because it's just brand new, a lot of new laws, and the Chinese government doesn't have the same level of want of protection for patents. India is also very different. Suing somebody, you actually have to have a product and a company to do that. So if you look at various countries, they have different views of the patent system. I always talk about the 3 legs of intellectual property, the IP stool, which is patents, trade secrets, and enabled publications, prior art. So when we start talking about the value of IP, I'm talking about all those three and how they're working together, not just patents. And as a way to, sort of take a look at patents as a business tool, I'd have you go to our episode 10, 6 ways to create value, where we actually covered specifically each of those ways of creating value and how to do that. This podcast is not a duplicate of this. It's a takeoff from that. There's another thing that's also very interesting in that patents are very different in terms of the value by tech sector. In medical equipment, you can't do a deal unless there's patents. It's the lifeblood of it. In software, where there's so much software, I mean, there's maybe 1 million patents inside of the iPhone. So it's a very different deal. And so you see royalty rates in medical for licensing in 10, 15%, whereas in software it could be half to 1%. So, and now what you see, and this is something that I'll talk about kind of at the end, but I wanted to bring it up here, is that you have the ability to do instant copycatting. When I was at IBM, we did this thing called backward patenting, which basically was saying that when you got the product ready to go out the door, you looked at it very carefully and figured out what you're going to patent. In other words, you're patenting things that you had thought about, but it's going in the product ready to go out the door, so that's what you patent. After a number of years in the patent factory, we started changing that approach to talk about forward patenting. And since I left IBM in 97, 98, it's been forward patenting ever since. And that is that you're kind of projecting through brainstorming the kind of inventions that you want. Now the game becomes how to enable it, because backward patents was already enabled in the product instantiation. But forward patents, you have to kind of enable it. And that became the thing. Around 2020, when LLMs and AI and ChatGPT came around, it became a recognition by us that even a series of prompts in a large language model could be patented. And so we started doing that. So we went from backward patenting to forward patenting to almost instant patenting. And now, in fact, at some point I'll put a podcast together on this, there's something really new going on with inventors and technical people sitting around AI, evolving things together. There's a new inventor in town called AI, and it's literally changing the world as we speak. So another reason to have this perceived value of IP is that I believe it's going to change again very quickly. Let's jump over to topic number 2, litigation. In litigation, the whole idea is that when you get a patent, you can stop somebody else from making, using, or selling in the country that you own the patent in. For litigation, what it's all about is the claims of the patent. It's not the idea of the patents, it's what the claims actually say. But in order to have a good litigation, you need to have clean title. So many companies get involved in thinking they want to litigate their patents to recognize that the title of their patents has some, problems. In other words, it could be an inventor that left who's recalcitrant. It could be that there's, you know, some argument about debt holders and they want to say that they own the patents of the company. There's also lots of patent defects. The specifications, there's prior art that could stop a patent from being litigated, even though it was issued. And that was a pretty big deal in the dot-com days, suing everybody and then using this new way of kind of searching companies' prior art to find prior art that would validate a patent. At one point, I bought a company called Article One Partners, and it had about 300,000 subscribers. And basically, we put a patent out, and basically, we'd have people from all over the world find prior art to knock it out. And then it became kind of like this kind of whole, business set of litigation. How to do it, how to set it up, how to make sure it works, how to knock it out, etc. Also, if we take a look at litigation, the U.S. courts are pretty strong here, but the courts in other countries, as I mentioned, are very different. You know, so thinking about patents in general and having a portfolio that may span countries is very different to say that I want a global patent portfolio. And so one has to take that into account as well. One of the things about litigation that is also very interesting is that outside of it being very costly, I mean, litigation may take 2, 3, 5 years or more. And even if you win, it might take you another 5 or 10 years to collect because there are all sorts of mechanisms to delay things. And so imagine waiting 10 years to get paid on a litigation that you had to pay your attorney 2, 3, 4, 5 million for. So there's a lot of risk there. So it's very costly. The big part of the initial cost is going to the Markman hearing, where the judge is trying to rule between the plaintiff and the defendant what the claims actually mean. So even though you have claims you're going to litigate against, the judge will help select what those claims are actually going to cover. And so that Markman is a great place to decide whether you go forward with the litigation or not. But you have to go to the Markman to figure that out, and that's costly as well. So if you want to decide to litigate, all these things along the way in litigation that could create impact to the perceived value and then the real value of the patents. And basically you have the struggle that not only does it cost a lot, but sometimes in litigations there's willful infringement, and the judge can rule up to 3x damages on that. So look at that value change right there. Are you going to litigate or not? Are you going to spend the money or not? Are you going to wait that time or not? Are you going to know what the Markman is? No, not until you do it. Are you going to go through that struggle? And what happens if you're wrong and there's 3x damages? So some of this, is just probabilistically calculated by the plaintiff and the defendant. But boy, think about trying to litigate. Now you know why I don't recommend it. One of the things about litigation also, one of the strategies I've seen for years is one company's trying to raise money and their competitor sues them for patent litigation, for patent suits. They just wanted to create disruption. They wanted to tell the new investors that if you put your money in this thing, that money's going to come to us because we're suing you. It's a strategy. Look, if you play chess, there's lots of tactics. They all have names, middle game, end games, opening games, chess masters. So IP is a chess game. It's actually a game for kings because it's pretty expensive sometimes. Another thing about litigation is you can use it as a business tool. If you're a large company and you sue a small company, that seems like a David and Goliath thing, but it's a real showstopper. Okay, you could not only stop a raise, but you might stop a market. Large companies can wield the tool of being large, but they can also wield the tool of litigation. Now, generally, we don't see a lot of large companies suing small companies because at the end of the day, they're going to get royalties from damages, and the small companies don't have lots of product out there, so you don't see that a lot. Another thing about litigation is the fear factor. Now, I know a lot of people, a lot of high net worth people, in fact, that have an innate fear of being sued. The last thing you want to do, and this has happened to me a number of times in ipCapital, is you get this registered letter and you open it up and someone's suing you for something. That's not fun, okay? Because the mind goes strange when it starts thinking about all the negative things that can happen. What if I lose? What if they take this from me? What if this happens? So litigation and the fear factor of it is something that becomes another business tool. Another thing that I've found over the years, and I've been involved in plenty of helping with litigation with clients, is, and I'm involved in one right now, we're actually shopping for the judge. You try to find the venue by which the judge is gonna, be the arbiter here. Just think about that in litigation. Outside of everything else I mentioned, we're gonna go judge shopping to try to find a judge that actually believes more about what we believe than the other side. And now there's AI tools to read all the judges' cases to see how they'll weigh. You see, like litigation is like this a rule book where you break one commandment and that's it. It's a world. Another thing about litigation is that AI is now in the case. The AI is being used to support the plaintiff and the defendant. It's doing things that it could never have done before. It's coming up with legal strategies and all sorts of things. It's not the same environment. Another thing about litigation is assessing the damages. If you take a look at the damages here and the assessment, it really determines whether you should litigate or try to license or do other kind of business deals. In other words, wouldn't it be kind of make sense before you start all this stuff with litigation to go through sort of an ROI calculator? We at ipCapital have something called IP valuation that helps with that. But I think that anybody thinks that they're going to do litigation, really needs to take a step back and get some expert advice on, the trade-offs and the ROI of it. And coming down to litigation also, there's this sort of litigating a portfolio or a single patent, or litigating a patent that's issued but has no longer, that's issued with no continuations possible. There's this whole area of people suing someone, and the defendant goes buys patents to countersue, or you sue someone and you file a continuation because it's a continuation that you want to add to the case. So not only is all this going on, but when you're suing someone or being defended against it, you have to even figure out all that stuff. And then if that isn't bad enough, sometimes there are patents that are expired, but because they're expired doesn't mean you can't sue because you can go back for latches and go back to reverse damages that have occurred that you didn't know of. So it's a world, and I don't recommend it, but it certainly is one of the perceived values of intellectual property. The very fact that you can sue somebody, okay, allows the value of patents to go up by definition. The fear of it, the business disruption of it, and all that stuff. Well, let's talk about what's coming up. IP monetization and selling. We're going to explore the art of the deal, licensing, selling, valuation. We're going to talk about claims. We're going to talk about doing deals. We're going to talk about how IP monetization is going to be used, how you're going to develop maybe an IP story, find the hook, understand buyers, and how you might customize that IP story to uncover and overcome the objections. So stay tuned. So topic number 3, IP monetization. Here we're going to talk about licensing and selling patents versus topic number 2, which was talking about the litigation. The first thing about IP monetization is it's a real art of the deal. There are some deal guys and deal gals out there that can take the same patents and get a deal done while others would struggle for years. It really does require expertise. If you've never done it, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you find someone who has. And basically, if you're trying to find a person, that is doing this sort of stuff. I used to run a licensing company. I created one and ran it and sold it off. And we had 14 top-notch deal guys, working with me. And the models of these experts could be just contingency, like 20, 25% of the deal. So one of the things about IP monetization is that when we talk about sort of licensing, is that you want to make sure that the patents are written for licensing. I'm sort of stopping here because when you have patents that are specifically written to cover a specific product, that patent is probably very good for litigation. But you need patents that are more broadly written to cover more variations. You need patents that have the ability to have continuations. You need to have the specification of the patent written so that we can interpret what the claims mean differently. Because when you're trying to license patents, you get to the point where, or even sell patents, you get to the point of, what's actually in the patent is where the value is. I remember many times selling patents to large companies, and I really couldn't figure out, why they buy them, but they did. And I remember once calling a very large company, who paid us like $6 million for about 4 or 5 patents. And I called them up and I said, now that the deal's over, thank you very much, but I'm just curious as to why you bought these patents. And they said, well, one of the patents still had an open continuation, and there was enough in that specification that we could basically write that new claims on that specification to get a new patent for a very major product that we're about to roll out. It wasn't the other, it wasn't the existing claim sets. Think about that as perceived value. It wasn't the claims that they were writing the license for. It was the fact that it was an issued patent, it had continuations, and it had a specification written that could be extracted up to a new product. Talk about the perceived value of IP. And that's why when we write the thousands of provisionals that we write in ipCapital, we're always trying to pack that specification to add the ability for continuations to enhance the perceived value. Another thing about monetization for licensing is that you could do valuation before you get started. Even my firm, ipCapital, we have a free online valuation calculator you should go find and check out. It's not pro forma and it's not, something that our brand would represent that we did the work, but it has the functionality of a calculator. And so, how much is your patent worth? Wouldn't you rather know that before you even decided to sell or license? This is all part of the perceived value of IP. If I have some IP and you have some IP, but I have some IP and I've done a valuation, my perceived value is going to be different than yours. Yours is going to be more of a guess. If I take the calculator, that's great. But you hire a firm to do valuation. There's not a lot of firms that do it around here, but that could raise the value again. If you have a branded company doing valuation for you and it's a good number, that adds the perceived value again. If you have three valuation companies value the same IP and it comes up to be a big number, three is better than one. The perceived value is going up. So you could see just in the valuation process how perceived value is going up. By the way, who uses those valuations? The people that are trying to see if the patents are worth anything, because they're going to have to debate against that. Another thing about the perceived value in licensing is the pendulum. It turns out that before the American Invent Act, most large companies had inbound licensing. In other words, I could call up the Microsofts of the world and the Apples of the world and Google, whatever, and they all had a group called inbound licensing. After the dot-com happened, and there were lawsuits everywhere, basically large companies recognized that looking at patents was not something they wanted to do to inbound license, and they just said, sue us. That's because they could rely on the legal gears to actually help invalidate patents. And they'd rather spend the money validating the patent than they would trying to buy or license it. Let's go back to Andrew Carnegie, right? He went across the entire US, the richest guy in the world, taking the time out of his year to go try to get the rights for a license of the best Steel patents. Look at the difference. Another thing about the perceived value is you sort of have to think about this in terms of how it's partitioned. What's the field of use of the patent? Your patent could be written very broadly, but it could have dependent claims that are written very specifically. So maybe your valuation of your IP, the perceived value, is very good in one market, but very shaky in another. And so we're not only valuing things through the valuation calculator, we're trying to find the markets to value it in. So now I have a patent. What's the perceived value? Look at all the questions I have to ask. What field of use? What claim? Or try to do it just generically. It becomes more abstract and more and less reliable. Another thing is if you think about selling your patents, and now I'll talk more about just the selling versus the licensing. We do have a podcast 38 and 39 that directly talk about how to set up and to sell your patents. So I suggest you go to those for more information. But let me talk a little bit more about monetization in terms of selling. There are average prices for patents to buy. It's kind of interesting, right? It's like every patent is unique, but there's groups of patents, like improvement patents in sort of retail or improvement patents in sort of medical devices. There's sort of bulk prices for this stuff. And so when you look at all the deals that are done, and there's a list published yearly about most of the licensing deals or sale deals that were exposed, the average prices could be like $150,000 to $200,000 for a patent, and that's usually for a company buying those that want to bulk up their portfolio, giving more variability and more probability that they would have higher perceived value. Another thing about selling or buying patents is that there are a lot of middlemen that get involved. If you take a look now, a lot of people are putting their patents behind a shell company. The shell company is there, so you just don't know who the seller or the buyer is. And you can't go to the pair of the patent literature to find out who obviously is the assignee. But sometimes with companies that have an inventor but not a company, you won't know who's behind it. And so that creates another strategy. Who is the buyer or the seller? Uh, so supposing you want to sell a patent to some company and they don't know who it's coming from. And supposing you want to buy a patent from somebody that's selling it to you. Well, what if it's, Apple who is the buyer? But you don't know that. You just know that some buyer, a middleman, is coming to you saying you want to sell your patent. So you want to sell your patent and Apple's interested? Oh, the price is going to go up. On the other hand, if someone wants to buy your patent and it's a guy starting a new company and he's just out of college, well, you're probably not thinking that he's going to get a lot of money. So just understanding the buyers in the middle is part of this monetization. Another part of selling is the art of finding the right buyer, and that's the art of finding the right hook. Many people mistake this. They think that somehow the patent has some specific value, just like you cash in the stock in the stock market. It isn't that way at all. It's the caveat emptor, the buyer beware. It's finding the hook, how to convince someone. And by the way, convincing someone to buy a patent is one of the most creative exercises I've ever seen. We do a lot of it at ipCapital. And in my licensing company, that's pretty much all we did, finding the right buyer and finding the hook to that buyer. If you can do that really well, the value of your patent is going up. Therefore, the perceived value of your IP is higher by simply finding the right buyer at the right hook. People won't buy stuff they don't need. Another thing about sort of monetization is putting together what we call an IP story. This is one of the services that my firm ipCapital has, but sort of think about it. I have this patent. Take a look at it. You want to buy it. On the other hand, I have this patent, but first of all, let me tell you about your business. I understand your business, and I think this is the direction your business is headed. We research the market that your business is in, and we see there's value there. We see the products that can be sold in your market or your business, and we understand the technology in your product in that market in your business. And we believe our IP can enhance that technology, the technology that you're using. It can enhance it inside of your product, inside of your market, inside of your business. An IP story ties together the business of the buyer to the IP that you're selling. So an IP story is really worth sort of considering. And if you're trying to do something where there's hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, might as well do it right because these IP stories don't cost that much. So spend some time thinking about that. And we also have a podcast in I Invent Anything about the IP story. You can learn more about that. Another thing about monetization is something brand new. And I'm only going to touch on this, but you can go to podcast 72, which is talking about the sort of downstream agentic IP. Basically, we've kind of recognized that when you file a patent, the day you file it, or the day you file a provisional, that day you're going to start to get value out of it. Because of this downstream agentic IP development that we're working on, it turns out that the perceived value of IP as of this invention of the downstream agentic IP program, I think will change the perceived value of IP dramatically. And I'm not going to go deeply into this. You can go to podcast 72. It's the beginning of it. But I believe this is the direction the entire future of intellectual property perceived value. That's a pretty big statement. But I've been doing this for a while, and I've seen a lot of things, and this is pretty exciting. And the last part about raising the perceived value in monetization and selling is sort of bundling your trade secrets, bundling your publications, even bundling an idea list. In one of the episodes we have, episode 29, we talk about doing an IP scan to extract all the ideas around your inventions and put that in a list. Yes, believe it or not, an idea list and a publication list and a trade secret list can actually hugely raise the value of your IP. And I ask you to take a look at those episodes to delve into that more. Now let's switch over to topic number 4, doing deals. I've done hundreds of deals with IP, and so I've kind of seen it all, if you will. But I want to hit some things that if you're going to do a deal to get the value out of your IP, then some of these things might help. Always seek expert advice is something I'd recommend. But one thing is for doing deals is to get your house in order, making sure the title is right, making sure the trade secrets are backed up, making sure you do a good job of that. We have a podcast called the Patent as a Poison Pill. I've been sending that to some new clients recently. And it talks about if you don't do filing the patent correctly, you could really impact the value of the company. So making sure that's all cleaned up would raise the value, raise the probability of success. A lot of times we would do deals to find out that people on the buyer's side or the licensee side found a whole bunch of problems with the title. Another thing about doing deals is recognizing that IP due diligence is sort of a phrase that's used. When a company's going to acquire you or a company wants to buy your patents, of course, they're going to do due diligence, right? And so we have episode 20, if you want to take a look at it, on the steps of IP due diligence and the thinking behind it. But doing good due diligence is extremely important. So before you get diligenced on, you should diligence yourself and use a third party to do it. Antiseptic or doesn't believe in you, it's doing it the way the buyer would do it. I mentioned this before, but doing deals is finding the hook, finding the company and finding the deal points. Um, the hook is something that gets a person inspired to want to buy. Like if you can prove that your patent is covered in, has good claims and it's covering a technology that when bolted on to a company's technology will give them a 25% improvement. That's very different than saying I have a patent that you might want to use. So in one sense, the hook is closer to their product and even specifically showing them how they connect. Um, with AI today, you could just create a moving video, right? Just by asking the engine to create a vehicle of your patent and the company's technology and produce a little video of how they connect and how they'll help. Think about what I just said. Finding the hook can now be very, very facilitated by using AI. Another thing about doing deals is you need to watch out for declaratory judgments. Well, when we were doing all the deals in the late 2000s, it turns out that there was a big concern by approaching someone with a sale or a license that the company you're approaching could basically sue you for declaratory judgment, claiming, that you are telling them they're going to sue you, that you're going to sue them. So, for instance, if you show up, try to do a deal, and try to tell the company we're going to sue you, they could sue you before you sue them on a declaratory judgment. So, another thing about doing deals is to watch out for declaratory judgment. So if you approach a company with some patents and you say, I'm going to sue you, they have the absolute right to say that, that you're impacting their business and there could be a tort suit to you. And you'd have to answer those claims before you get to your patent claims. But, the finesse of how to show that they're actually using your patent without getting a DJ is what we had specialized in when we did all these licensing and sale deals in the licensing company. What you try to do is create a black box saying, I don't exactly know what's inside your technology, but when I add my technology to your black box, it seems like it improves it. Even at IBM in the licensing days, we created this thing called a proof package, where we could take a picture of our product and show how our claims equal to our product, and then show the company we're trying to license to, we'd show them a picture of their product, and we say, look, our picture looks like your picture, but we never said you're violating our claims. It was just sort of this logical inference that if my picture looks like your picture, and my picture equals my claims, then probably your picture is my claims. Another thing about doing deals is the role of valuation once again. It's sort of know when you want to hold them or not. So if you're doing a deal and you're trying to get something sub million and someone's starting to offer you, 400,000 or 500,000, that's really good. You might try a little bit more, but if they offer you like 3 or 4 million, you might decide to close that deal pretty quickly. So, and the reverse is also true. So the role of valuation and knowing how much it's worth really helps. I mean, that's why we have the Kelly Blue Book, right, for cars, is to know when you're going to get a good deal or not. That doesn't exist for patents, but the closest we come is the valuation. Another thing is in doing deals, and again, these are just points from a person that's done a bunch of deals that might help you if you're in the middle of doing deals. And the reason why we're talking about deals is it's a big part of the perceived value of IP. Because if you know how to do deals, the value is going to be higher. If you don't know how to do deals, then the perceived value of your patents is going to be lower to you until you find somebody that does know how to do deals, if that makes any sense at all. So doing deals, one of the things is the mind of the general is what's really needed. Sun Tzu, The Art of War, said he doesn't attack the army, he attacks the mind of the general, one of his many sayings. So what we want to do is attack the mind of the buyer. We want to raise our credibility. I did a deal where it was about 165 million at the end of the day. And basically we had created this drumbeat about we have these patents and then we file these provisionals and then some of these provisionals turn into patents and and we have a very high track record of what we file turns out to be issued patents. And since we had about 20 issued patents and about 70 non-issued patents, I remember the vice president in the deal that we were doing, because I was negotiating it. At one point, he told his team to stand down. He says, "We get it, John." In other words, what he got was the 70 extra filings were all going to become patents. And he wanted his patent staff to stop talking about it because we had the credibility. So the mind of the buyer is to affect the mind of the buyer that you are good, that you know what you're doing, that you can get more patents, you can get better continuations. Look at that. Doesn't that impact the perceived value of the IP? See what I mean about this perceived value of the IP? Look at all the things that drive it. We talked about the IP story before, and once again, I can point you to the podcast, but the IP story is putting your IP in the buyer's point of view. You want them to feel they're going to get value out of buying it, right? You don't try to sell your used car to someone because you know the engine's going to be going any day. You sell your used car because you think it's going to help the kid go to college, right? You know that the parents could buy it to help the kids get to college and etc. So you want to shine the light on the best parts of your IP. Another thing about doing deals is uncovering objections. I can't tell you, I could spend an hour just on this one thing that I learned in doing some deals. This actually came from my brother, who's a venture capitalist and had a $5 billion fund, West Presidio Capital. And he would basically say, John, in doing a deal, when I first raised money for ipCapital, he says, well, what you need to do is you need to kind of write down any objection you hear. So you go to a VC, they're going to tell you why they don't want to do put money in, write that down, and then go back and think about it, and then go fix it in your PowerPoint deck and in your business so you can answer that objection. And I did that 3 or 4 times in a row. And I remember the fourth VC we talked to, where they asked all the same questions as the past VCs, but had an answer for every one of them. And I just remember them saying, John, you got yourself a deal. And I was like, huh. Now, my brother had done hundreds and hundreds of deals. He understands objections. If you understand the objections, that's looking in the mirror and finding the objections about your inventions and your IP so that you know what they're going to say and then figuring out a way to answer it, which is a whole other topic, then what have you done? You've raised the value. Another thing about doing deals is sort of the power of serendipity. I can tell you that, think about this, the perceived value of IP. How much is your patents worth? It's worth X. And then you go to a company, you open up the door, you show them your portfolio, and they make you a strong offer without much work. That's happened to me 2 or 3 times. How did that happen? It turns out that that company was looking at this other company's patent for a while, and they were hoping to get a good deal. And when we showed up, when we said kind of the range that we wanted, they already knew what they wanted to spend, and we were the good deal, right? Serendipity is very powerful. How do you add serendipity to the perceived value of IP? And finally, on doing deals, getting a realism of the whole process and the value is important. You kind of go into it almost like it's a board game. Don't get so worried and get so mixed up and so emotional about it. Business is business. Think about it as you may learn something and try to pitch your deal to somebody that you can then change to go to somebody else, or you may find some new value driver along the way. You didn't know that something happened and now your patents are more valuable. Happens a lot. So there's all sorts of stuff. So doing deals, have some realism that it's a journey to get the value out. It's not a loss if you don't get your absolute value on the first 2 people you talk to. So coming up, we're going to talk about things like financing, MBAs, ABLs, asset-based lending, raising money, and we'll reveal how all these things can help and how you can improve it through the IP story. We'll also talk about what affects the perceived value. We'll show you how the patent pendulum, the marketing, the patent numbers, all that stuff are going to impact the value. And it's really important to understand the things that affect the perceived value. And I want to end all of this with a little story that I give all the time to my clients about the perceived value of the IP, which is called the bookcase. Now, if we talk about ABLs a different way, since I sort of set this up that it's a collateralized loan, let me just talk about what I see as the best approach. One of the things I've seen is that you just can't get a loan on patents. It has to be a business generally. And if the business has an income statement to service the loan, meaning that it can pay back the loan over time, that's great. A lot of companies won't give you, a lot of banks won't give you a loan, even if you can pay them back. They think it's too high risk. The patents are the things that actually help you lower that risk. So basically, the patents will de-risk the loan. And so what happens is you start off with a good income statement, that's good, and a good portfolio. That's really what the ABLs are there for. They want to know you can service the loan without selling the patents. And so if for some reason you try to sell your patents to get your money back, the ABLs don't want to be the selling patents. So that train sort of left the station. It's good companies with good income statements, where you're generating revenue, you have cash, and that you want to raise some money and using patents as backing it up, you're in a great position. If you're not making a lot of money and you can't pay back the loan, or there's all sorts of problems with the business, don't spend your time trying to get an ABL. It just won't work. That's from my view. Maybe it might be somebody that may be crazy enough to want to take your deal, but in general, ABLs aren't in that business. Another thing about ABLs is that there are companies that are sophisticated enough to understand that they can read patents and try to value them. The reason why my firm would get involved in ABLs is ABLs would bring us in to value the patent portfolio. Make sense? Well, we talked about valuation. On the other hand, though, there are mid and small banks that if you're doing your banking with a local bank or a mid-sized bank, we actually get to know the people and they want to give you a loan. Sometimes because they know you, if you tell them that you have patents, they might not be sophisticated about financing patents, but they'll take your word. So many times patents can be the thing that allows your banker to give you the loan where they wouldn't have given it earlier. And they're not experts at patents and they're not asking for patent valuation. You just put it on the table as an asset. Of course, here, more patents are better, etc. Another thing about raising money is, I'm going to bring this idea of a bookcase up as I talked about it. Uh, so there's a lot of clients that come to me and say that they're trying to raise money, or we bring up the idea that patents might help them raise money, and they challenge that. So I sort of say to them, look, I've come up with this little story about a bookcase. There's books on the left, books on the right, and you go all the way through. And let's just imagine this is a bookcase that describes the general interest of venture capitalists and private equity people, loaning you money based upon patents. On the far left-hand side of the bookcase, there are private equity guys and VCs that think the patents are totally worthless. As a matter of fact, that if you invested in patents, uh, they think that you don't know how to run a business. You should be spending the money in a product or prototype or marketing, not in patents, because that'd be silly. So those are in the far left-hand side. As we move a little bit more over, what we find is that some investors start to think about, if these guys have patents, it proves to me that they're novel. See, the patent office doesn't have a dog in the fight, right? The patent office is going to give you this patent because they think it's novel. So to some investors, it's like a checklist. At least the patent office did some of their work because it's novel. That's a good thing. So as they move a little bit more over, as a matter of fact, as I keep moving over, the better it is. So as I move over a little bit more, there are those investors that say, if the company has a patent, they probably won't get sued because they have a patent. By the way, this is incorrect, totally incorrect thinking. But a lot of investors think this way. A patent doesn't stop a lawsuit. A patent allows you to have a lawsuit. You can stop somebody else from using or selling. Just because you have a patent on your invention doesn't mean you can't be sued by somebody else that has a patent on a part of your invention. More on that later, I guess. So that's another reason. So let's go to move a little bit right in the bookcase again. There's some investors that would say they have patents, that's good, and that must give them some ability to get some cash back because maybe someone's violating their patent and maybe we could sue somebody. So now they're thinking about it as a cash machine. As they move over to the right a little bit more, they're thinking, okay, we got this, particular company that has these patents, and if the company doesn't work, we'll own the patents. At least we got some asset there. So as they keep moving from left to right, they're piling on more and more of the reasons of why that's values. And finally, you get sort of towards the right, and all of a sudden the company says, "Yeah, you have patents. Certainly, you know, we'll take a look at that, and that's really good because I'm doing lots of deals, and I don't want to do deals unless there's some other protection, like the asset of patents or some value." And so they'll do a deal because you've answered all those questions of the bookcase, but now they're also thinking forwardly about, how they can make leverage off of your patents. Finally, you're kind of over on the right, And they're investors that won't do a deal unless there's good patents. Because there have been deals where they've made 800 million, 2 billion, whatever, because of the patents. They know that there's a 20, 30, 40x multiple on revenues if you have a good patent portfolio. They know things about patents. These are not taught in business schools. They're actually taught on the road with investors. And if you look at 1,000 investors, there's probably maybe 10% of investors that are way on that right-hand side. So when people ask me, is it going to help me raise money? That is patents. My answer is it depends upon where in the bookcase the investor is. Because if you find them on the far right, chances are. And the last thing I'll say is that I've never seen an investor change their valuation because you have patents. If you don't, if you show up and you talk about your deal and they say, this is what it's worth, and I'm willing to do the deal. And if you want to bring up patents after the fact, that won't raise valuation at all. There's something psychologically when they put a value on it, they won't up it because of patents. On the other hand, if you bring patents up front, it may be the very thing that adds to the valuation, but more importantly, it's probably going to add to the probability the deal gets done. That's what we've seen. Another thing about raising money is, and we mentioned this, and I'll just footnote it again, it's all about how you tell the IP story and if you have a valuation. Having these two things together very help. I know what its value is, and here's the story to tell it. If you can't develop a story and understand the value, it's going to be very difficult to raise money. Another thing about raising money is there's a lot of leverage in having patents, of course, but now you can pile on the provisionals, pile on new inventions from an idea list, pile on trade secrets, pile on publications. So it's the three legs of the IP stool, right? So what you're trying to do when you're raising money, yeah, you got some patents issued. Great. Let's start with that. Let's get some more provisionals filed, right? Let's develop an idea list because if I got an idea list, they know that I can file a provisional. If I have a provisional, they're likely to know that I can get a patent because I proved that. So you see, adding credibility this way allows you to do this. Adding trade secrets to this is a pièce de résistance because in trade secrets, there's ways, I won't go through it here, where you can patent something, but also have trade secrets on the same aspects. Now, there's going to be attorneys and everybody else say you can't do that. You have to have best mode. There's answers for this on when you file the patent and when you know the best mode and where your trade secrets are. And so trade secrets today are becoming more and more valuable. Another way to shift gears is using an IP to get value in an M&A. This is clearly the greatest way to get value out of patents because there's kind of like this hockey stick at 10 or 15 patents when you kind of look at the valuation of the M&A on the y-axis against the number of patents in the deal in the x-axis. And you kind of look at that. You do a scattergram of deals. You find out the valuation jumps from 2, 3, 4x revenue to 20, 40, 50x revenue around 10 or 15 patents. I can't go into the reasons for this, but we have, just because of time, but when we work for large companies who are buying small companies, they might hire my firm to invent around the patents because, yes, they want to do a deal with the company, but they don't want to pay high multiples. They're really not worried about your patents, that you're going to sue them because they're David and you're Goliath and they can outlast you and all that stuff. They're really worried that if somebody else buys you, maybe a competitor to them, two large companies that have cash, the portfolio is meaningful. So they can add a higher valuation. Another thing about M&A is that you can use the patents to attract the giants. You can do competitive analysis, or they do competitive analysis. And we do a lot of IP and analytical programs for large companies. And we literally break out, here are the main top 10 companies, and we break out if there's a small company that has patents. I can't tell you the amount of conversations I've had, presentations I've had with sort of the IP director and the VP of business, and we're showing the patent analytics, and they'll say, what company is that again? And I say, well, it's a small company. And we looked at it, our analysis shows it has patents in 3 different technology categories. And all of a sudden, they're using our analysis, and sometimes they take our analysis and they send their scouts over to take a look at the company because they might want to buy it. In other words, by having patents where large companies can look and find you, innovation scouts, it's a great way to kind of, add press for you. Another thing about M&A is that trade secrets are really required for you to do a deal with IP because I've seen so many small companies who claim that everything that they told the company that was going to acquire them was stolen by the acquiring company, where the acquiring company asked all sorts of questions over 6 months or a year and then wouldn't pick up the phone and talk to them again. And then the large company starts doing that. This is because the small company doesn't understand how to really protect its trade secrets, nor how to leverage it. I doubt very much in most cases the large companies are trying to steal anything. Uh, they just don't know that you think it's a trade secret. They kind of developed it. So putting together a trade secret story is another part of the IP story. And finally, another part of the M&A is filling in the white space. So one of the things is that understanding how value is produced. So there's a story that I've heard over the years of Dr. John who developed the rotary toothbrush. He tried to develop a business about it. He had a whole bunch of patents. And as I understand the story goes, he was trying to sell his company because he couldn't get revenues more than 10 million. And as the story goes, Procter and Gamble bought him, and it became a billion-dollar category the next year. So why would this sort of Dr. John approach, why couldn't he do it? Well, Procter and Gamble has brand. They have shelves all over the planet Earth. They took this thing and turned it into a category. So look at the leverage of a large company buying a small company. When they get your inventions and they get your IP, they can leverage it in a way that you could never leverage it. And that's why they'd pay a lot of money for it, particularly if they can get it before you sell it to somebody else. So we'll leave you with this. The M&A is the highest way to get perceived value. The hockey sticks around 10 to 15 patents. And if you really want to raise the value of your company significantly, patents are one of the only real ways to do it. Let's go to topic number 6. What affects the perceived value anyway? And it's kind of like a compendium of all the stuff I talked about. The first is the zeitgeist. Where is the pendulum today? Is there more value or not? I mentioned, the patent office director, and they're not allowing the inter partes review anymore, or in most cases. So that's raising the value. I can't tell you how many companies have come to me now looking to ask whether they should litigate because they're now feeling that their attorneys are thinking that it's a better environment to sue. Again, I'm not part of, nor do I recommend lawsuits because of all the things I